Okay, we are live. Cool. Alright, so speaking times, maximum of 8 minutes, POIs between 1 and 7. I'll give one flat at 1 minute and one flat at 7 minutes, and then 2 flats at 8. Anyone have any questions, comments, concerns? Cool. And without further ado, we'll invite first after the floor to Ms. Back.
Your rapist is in a restaurant with a girl who has no physical way of telling his incentives, of telling that she is next. A couple things to do in this speech. Firstly, some framing, then on the likelihood of reoffending, and then on the psychological harms of the victim. Okay, firstly on some framing. What does violent crime likely to look like? Violent crime looks like any crime in which an act of violence has been used against someone, right? This looks like one person causing bodily harm to another person. This looks like aggravated assault at a lower end, sexual assault and murder at a higher end, right? Note, if you do not commit an act of violence, this is not under the threshold of a debate, right? This is not about like robbing a supermarket with a threat. This is about like going into countdown and stabbing 7 people, right? Okay, what this means is it narrows the debate significantly, right? You cannot buy these people are innocent products of circumstance. They pulled the trigger, they end life, they act selfishly. Things like rape are inherently unjustifiable and purely for your own personal benefit, right? Quickly then on victims. Victims are always the most vulnerable person in this scenario, right? They are the people most affected. There are 2 main types of this debate. Firstly, people who are victims and like traumatized, and secondly, the potential future victims, right? Whether or not these people will be victims is determined on like what we tell you in this debate. Then likelihood to reoffend, right? Firstly, like why are you likely to reoffend? Firstly, like you've already crossed the line of hurting someone, it's much easier to do it again. Secondly, you're probably quite unstable. You're angry, you don't care about others, drugs, you're disillusioned with the system, etc. Third, this like often have criminal connections, right? To gun dealers, gangs, etc. And like this is like fostered by prison as well. Fourthly, like prison amplifies all of this. It's harsh, it's brutal, they come out more angry. Okay, what are the alternatives? Maybe like in the status quo, it's like community, like parole officers, just like checkups like maybe once every 2 weeks, and like these aren't able to monitor all the time, and like there just aren't many examples of people like being successfully rehabilitated, right? And then local cops like can't prevent; they only react when people get hurt when it couldn't have been prevented. In every world, it is always better to know exactly where the violent offender is at all times, right? This is why this is so successful. So before I do my first point, I'll take a POI.
Is a surveillance state justified if you prevent some crime?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Is a surveillance state justified if you prevent some crime?
Yes, I think it absolutely is, right? I think it is totally where we to cop the like principal harm of a surveillance state if we are saving women from being futurely assaulted and murdered, right? I think this is very important. So how does this bracelet actually prevent reoffending? This is our first point, right? The context here. Once you have offended once, you are 50% more likely to reoffend, right? The threshold has been breached. I gave you all these mechanisms in framing. So a couple mechanisms here. Firstly, the bracelet tracks you, right? It can register if you're loitering in certain areas commonly associated with crime or struggle, right? This looks like a gun store, known gang houses, or even a school or a bar, right? Note, if the other team tells you anything about the vulnerability of these people, this is a concrete way that does not exist in their world to provide rehabilitation measures and cut the issue at the roots, right? This is super important because you can wrench for future crimes and stop before the harm is done. Secondly, a visual warning to others. If you're a gun store owner, a teacher, a parent, or just a regular person, a mildly drunk student on the side of the road, right? I think like seeing this bracelet gives you a clear warning, right? Note, People like sex offenders don't have it stamped on their forehead. Unless you're employing this person or you're their neighbour, they have no legal obligation to tell you. I think what this means for the debate is that in our world, you will always be able to tell if a person is dangerous or could have very bad incentives, and it's always good to at least be warned. Thirdly here, shame, right? On these people there is a disincentive to commit crime when your entire life will have this, right? If you have kids, it will be in their graduation photos, right? It follows you forever. Obviously, on neither side do you want to go to prison, but I think the idea of having a physical reminder forever is really, really big. Finally, reminder leads to remorse, right? It is literally a weight on you that you will always see. You are always reminded of the mistake. Maybe I shouldn't take that 4th drink because I might act irrationally and I might do something I really regret. This is always on you. You always see what happens when you slip up. The outcomes at this point, we get significantly fewer instances of violent crime. This means that fewer women get raped, fewer innocent people get mugged and bruised on the street, right? This is the most important outcome in the debate because of the permanence, because of the scale, because of the sheer amount of harm that occurs here. Okay. No, thank you. Then on psychological harms on the victim, right? Okay, so some context here. First of all, domestic abuse and sexual assault go unbelievably under-monitored after these people are escaped from prison, right? Let out from prison, right? I think this is very, very common across the other world. These events are life-alteringly traumatizing is another massive piece of context here, right? You can never engage with intimacy in the same way. You can never sleep through the night. You live every day in life in fear, right? You distrust everyone. I think without this physical show of their mistake, you live with the knowledge they could do this again to someone else. Three mechanisms here, right? Firstly, refer to the mechanism we gave you. Secondly, on the visual warning, right? On just the literal capability of being able to see that someone poses a threat, that someone could do something dangerous or has done something dangerous, right? Secondly, seeing this person living their life back in the community, people don't know what they did without this bracelet, right? Maybe they just move a town over, talk to a different friend group, talk to a different circle, make their own new life, right? This is immensely psychologically harmful to the victim because they will never get to move on and escape from this pain, but the person gets to, right? They get to move on, they get to live scot-free. I think this is terrible, right? Thirdly, this is a really big one as well, you don't know if they're coming after you. You don't know if they're following you. We told you these bracelets tend to have things like tracking measures in them, right? And they tend to monitor what type of areas you are lurking in, right? I think this means if you can see their patterns and behavior, if you're paranoid, if you think they might come after you again, you can go to the police. You can tell them, can I see where my ex-husband has been lurking? You see if he's near your work. You see if he's near your school. You see all this type of stuff, right? If he's hanging around these areas, the police will know it, they can see it, they can stop it. I think this is really, really huge for the debate, right? Okay, some outcomes here, right? These incredibly traumatized people just don't have the same sense of assurance in their world. Not knowing is almost worse than knowing, right? It's going to eat away at these people. I think when you don't know if someone is after you, it creates anxiety, isolation, at higher levels, agoraphobia and suicide attempts, right? I think this is massive. Also just the horror of wondering if you didn't do enough, if this person is still permanently hurting other people, weighs really highly here. Other outcome here, I gave you the example of you see your ex-husband on a date with another woman. She has no idea he was in prison for beating you and your children, right? This is horror, it reopens old wounds, anger, anguish, massive psychological harm. Note, 97% of women undergo sexual assault in their lives. This is literally millions upon billions of people on the planet. If you even believe there is a slight benefit, this is massive because we just get a massive psychological benefit to literally millions and millions of women who are severely traumatized across the entire world, right? I think this is so massive. I don't think anything they tell you about the surveillance state or vulnerability of the people who literally raped these women is going to do anything, right? I think at the end of the day, when we diminish the amount of violent crimes and we diminish the psychological harms of these people, that will always be what matters the most. I am so proud to stand.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech and invite the person ready to the floor.
when these violent criminals feel so many eyes on them is the point at which they feel more pressured, and at the point at which they're likely to buy into other harmful actors such as gangs, which makes them even more subjective to like reoffending. 3 substantive points from our side. Firstly, on reducing effectiveness of reoffending. Secondly, on increased vulnerability to violent crime. And thirdly, Isabella will provide you a split on the impact on the individual. But before I get into any setup or substantives, 3 key pushes that we've heard and some responses to them, right? Firstly, on reoffending and knowing what these people are going to do, on predictability. I think that even if you know the location of this person, you likely do not know their intentions or what they want to do, right? Even if you know that they're at a gun shop, you don't know whether they're going to be able to like, if they have the capacity, firstly, to do it, or like the incentives to actually do it. Like most of these people, I don't think that if they really want to like commit another violent crime, they're likely to be at a gun shop, because they're likely to like want to plot, and they're likely to like, hide their intentions if they know they're being located, and so that this is likely to be less predictable. But then secondly, on like wariness and people being more prepared, I think that like when you have like a lot of eyes on you, it just creates more like legitimacy and like more pressure for the individual to feel like they feel mistrusted from society, and feel the pressure and feel like on their tipping edge to like have more violent crimes and to commit more violent crimes. But why is this bad? Firstly, this is bad for like the person because they like feel more pressure. But secondly, I don't think like even at the point at which you know this person's done bad crimes and they're like your neighbor, I don't think, other than feeling on edge all time, other than feeling that like you're on imminent harm all time, I don't think that there's much you can do to be able to like predict what they're going to do and how they're going to harm you. But then thirdly, on the guilt mechanism, I think that like they tell you that, oh, you're likely going to feel guilty and then you're likely not to reoffend. Why is this not likely? I think like firstly, when you feel guilty, this is like a constant haunting or reminder of the past, that you can't move forward, that you can't progress, and that society will never accept that you've changed, even at the point at which you do. I'll take a POI.
Do the police not have the power to do follow-up investigations after they find out where someone is?
I think that like, okay, you know the location, I just don't think that you can as easily be able to have mechanisms to go out and like just like be able to investigate the whole thing, because you don't know what their incentives or intentions are behind like what they're doing. So it's not as easy as like the affirmative side tries to sell to you, right? But then secondly, on setup, I think we maintain the status quo. We still stand for judges allocating parole time and adhering to the time deemed to be most fitting to the person's like sentence, but we disagree that this should be like the rest of your life. We think that this is too long. But then firstly, on a characterization point, why do people commit crimes? I think we've heard a lot about how these people are just innately violent, right? I think violent crimes are unique because humans aren't innately violent, right? We like to live in communities, we like to build families, we like to like interact with other humans, right? I think that normally there are huge underlying causes such as desperation that put you over the edge and cause you to commit violent crimes. I think that what influences someone to like, this looks like in the criminal justice system, where we recognize that and people get discounts based on like their backgrounds, and they get like their sentence shortened basically on their like background. But what influences someone to do crime? I think that there are numerous environmental factors that arise from an individual's background. Firstly, poverty and the desperation to feed your family. I think it pushes people off the edge. But then secondly, like growing up in a crime affiliated environment where violence is normalized, because this is seen as a response to solving an issue, and this is like seen as something that you must do. But then note that this means that on our side of the house, we're able to rehabilitate people and we're able to like solve the problem rather than putting a lid on a ticking time bomb, right? But then note here that first-time offences are probably like largely symmetrical, where they tell you we can like reduce that. I think people optimistically believe that they won't be caught, so like punishment isn't really doing anything. Moving on to my first point on like reducing effectiveness and rehabilitation. I think for context, most criminal justice systems build around ideas of retribution, but also rehabilitation, right? So firstly, on the reminder, which I've already talked about in my rebuttal, I think that it means that like whenever you're doing your normal day-to-day activities, it interacts with you. When you're trying to put your pants on, it gets stuck in like, I don't know, the stitchings of it. So it's like a constant reminder that this ankle bracelet is constantly on you, and that society will always see you as a violent criminal, and that you'll never be able to progress progress. And when you're in that mentality, I think it's extremely hard to grow out of it and to feel like you're not being restricted from growing, so these people aren't able to progress further. And then secondly, on targeting, I think gang patches, and when you have gang patches and family connected to like gangs, it means that you're likely to be targeted by this group. Firstly, because they think that you're willing to do it again, because you're a vulnerable target, because they think you've had violent tendencies in the past, so you could do it in the future. So gangs are likely wanting to recruit these gang members because like you've got this bracelet. But then secondly, on like your ability to reintegrate into general society. Like when you apply to a job, sure, it's great that your interviewer checks your background for any criminal background, but then I think on the comparative, what you get is like people judging you based off your ankle bracelet rather than like the person you are or into the person that you've progressed to be since the time of your sentence where you've already served the consequences of your actions, right? I think employers even at the point at which an employer understands that you've grown, they cannot offer you a job if it's at a front line because people will judge you based off the ankle bracelet. I think when you go to supermarkets where you do day-to-day life activities, where you drop your children off, you will always be judged harshly by society, which will cause you to feel isolated, and you turn to these harmful actors such as gangs and you re-offend more, right? So you get more of that on their side of the house. We provide you with change and the ability to rehabilitate these people and give them better lives, not only for themselves but for everyone in society, because they're able to progress and move further, right? And so that every person you rehabilitate is one that is less likely to commit crime and like be a bad person. Why is this important? Because people contribute economically, our economies grow, because like you have more people like working, you have more people like providing for their families rather than relying on government services. But then secondly, on like increased vulnerability to violent crime, I think for impact, I think judges normally consider all impact and harm for an individual life, but I think now it's going to affect like the sentences because they understand that they already have like a punishment for the rest of their lives through this bracelet, that their sentences are likely going to be shorter because they think that like, oh, and this means that you're likely to have like violent criminals going out into society before they're prepared for it because they get less sentencing. I think that secondly, monitoring criminals for the rest of their life in public means that the public has a false sense of security, that they feel, oh, because the government is monitoring them, this harm is mitigated, and they feel like they're secure. But this is not likely going to happen, as I've already talked about. Like, we don't know these people's intentions, we don't know what they're plotting, so people are less likely to be actually anticipating them, which will cause them more harm. I think at the end of this point, what you should believe is that individuals that are like genuinely released from violent crimes and into society early are able to commit more violent crimes. We spend like government resources and findings on developments rather than like on these electrical monitors. We think that this is extremely important, so proud to negate it.
Okay, I'd like that to speak for the speech and invite second F to the floor.
The negating team tells you about how it's so important to rehabilitate these poor criminals. What about the victims who can never move on because their entire life has been torn apart by a violent act? They never get to move on and to get negating thing. They never get closure. They never get justice. They are the most vulnerable people. They never asked for this, right? You should care about them the most. Okay, what am I going to do in my speech? A lot on the main push about like reoffending and rehabilitation, but like firstly on like why do we commit crimes and what are the alternatives? Okay. What does a negating team tell you about like why you should commit, like why people commit crimes? They tell you about these underlying causes, how you come from a violent background, right? I think this is actually just really helpful for them because I think it just means you're like, if this is ingrained in your psyche, you're just more likely to reoffend, right? I think this means rehabilitation is now less likely, right? I think they tell you a lot about rehabilitation, but if you accept this like characterization of them, if they've grown up with violence, right, that is always the first thing they turn to. Okay, and then what also do we tell you? Well, like the status quo is never enough. Sure.
How would this work in like a state such as China, for example?
Look, I think China's like mild, like very corrupt, and I think if you just commit a crime in China, they'd probably just arrest you and beat you and like and never let you out, and like unless you want to. I think if we're looking at corrupt states, it's the same on both sides. You're screwed either way, right? Like I don't think that really stands in the debate. But okay, what happens to the criminal on their side, right? We tell you about how like the status quo you cannot monitor, but what do they say? They tell you that you don't know their intentions. A couple responses here. Firstly, I think if you're a registered sex offender and you hang outside a primary school every day, right? I think your intentions are pretty clear there. If you go to a gun store and you've just killed 3 people with a gun, I think your intentions are pretty clear there. But like even if we take them at the best case and it's like very murky, right? I think this is still enough data to like send up red flags, right? It like sends up algorithms, right? The police have the power to investigate, right? Like there are still parole officers, there are still like police don't want crimes to happen, right? It's pretty clear that if the tracker is sending up some red flags, right, they are going to go and investigate. Indeed, that is their only purpose in the community, right? I think it's pretty clear that they will, in fact, do that, right? Like, the bracelet is the Kickstarter for that. On their side, it never happens. Maybe they go to a community officer once every 2 weeks. Maybe they chat about their feelings, right? But look, I think their own mechanism here works against them when they tell you that they want to hide their intentions, right? I think this means when you monitor them less, you never know if they're going to commit a crime or not, right? I think this means just as more reoffending happens on their side, right? The trade-off, okay. What then should you believe on reoffending, right? We tell you so many reasons, and they add to these reasons, right? So I think you should believe that these people are so much more likely to commit a crime than regular people, just as a baseline, right? They've already crossed that threshold of harming another being. They are so much more likely to do it again. I think this merits a higher level of surveillance than a normal person, right? So, like, what are the outcomes of this? It means that, like, future victims, like, they are just never hurt, their lives are never life altered, right? And we also tell you about the past victims, right? They get justice. The trade-off here is a violent criminal who traumatized someone for life is like haunted by guilt or judged, versus the person they traumatized is now like safe, mentally okay. They're not worried about them like popping up behind a fence and like hurting them again, right? I think you should always value like the victim's mental like stability, right? Over like some maybe guilt, right? Like, and also on this, right? I think on either side, these people go to prison. I think prison is probably like just the worst thing. Like, I think you can't live a normal life once you go to prison. That is already on your sentence, right? I think employers just don't hire you on either side, right? Like, if you take them at their best case, right? I think you just don't get hired on either side because you've got that 5-year prison sentence for aggravated robbery on your sentence, right? But also note here that the like council and your governments do provide like rehabilitation programs towards like sentences, right? So I don't think it's really as bad as they say. What this means here is that at the end of this like point in the debate, you should weigh the possible. You should weigh like the victim can never move on, right? On either side, this rapist, this murderer, this like person who's just stabbed 7 people, right? They may be able to move on. They may be able to have a normal life. On the negating team, no one knows what they've done, right? They can just move to another town and live their life scot-free. The victim can never do that. The victim can never move on, right? Because they're like literally injured, either like physically or mentally, right? Like, this is so horrible. I think this means that even if we take them just like at their best case, accept all their mechanisms, believe whatever they say, right, and the offender is like riddled with guilt because of this ankle bracelet, like, I just don't care at all. Like, I genuinely don't, because the victim, like, what happens when this person just is like left without the ankle bracelet, right? You see this rape, your husband who's just beaten you up is like chatting to another girl, right? You can't go over to the another girl and warn him because she's just gonna think you're the crazy ex, right? He gets away with it. He gets to do other, like, even more bad stuff, right? The person who stabbed your brother in the supermarket is just walking around scot-free. He's at the bar drinking, right? This is so deeply concerning for you. You can never move on. You're always seeing ghosts over your shoulder. You're always worried about the possibility of more violence. Like, okay, quickly on, like, a judge. Like, they tell you that the judge, like, is probably more likely to shorten the sentence. Why is this not like, firstly, like, there's just like a standard sentencing code that all judges have to follow, right? Like, I think the sentencing code doesn't just get abolished on our side. I think you still get like 20 years to life for murder on either side of the world, like on either side of the debate, right? I think you still, like, I think it's highly unlikely the judge is going to shorten the sentence. And also just note, like, the mentality of, like, the government and, like, toughen crime, right? And if you do implement this ankle bracelet, this probably means you do view criminals as, like, dangerous people, right? You don't just, like, shorten their sentence so they can be let out in the community to be monitored to, like, maybe commit a crime. I think it's pretty clear you just keep them in prison for longer. Okay, lastly, quickly on rehabilitation. Note that when you have an ankle bracelet, like, they tell you all this stuff about, like, gangs recruiting you and, like, you get, like, sucked back into the criminal underworld. I think we actually, like, prevent this on our side when you have an ankle bracelet monitoring, right? When you can see if this like vulnerable person who was in a gang is like going back to like the gang houses, like meeting up with these contacts, right? I think you can now pull them in. You can like stop them doing this. You can send them to the rehabilitation centers, right? In the status quo, they can never do that. They get less rehabilitation on our side, right? Like on outside, they're monitored. Police can see your gang contact, right? It's almost so much better. And anyway, like if you take them at best case, gangs just recruit ex-prison members anyway. So like if at the best case, it's just symmetrical. Okay, what happens at the end of this debate, right? Judge, hundreds and thousands of innocent lives hang in the balance here, right? Hundreds and thousands of future lives, depending on what happens in this debate, right? The people who may be future victims of this crime, the crimes not yet committed, that could be prevented if we watch these criminals, if we're able to see if they're going to commit a crime next, right? I think you should always weigh this higher in the debate because, like, on a sheer scale, right, these people, there are so many potential people, right, from, like, domestic abuse to just even, like, a mildly drunk uni student, right? Now they all don't have terrible, life-altering events happen to them. We will always stand for this. I'm proud to stand.
I'd like them to speak for their speech and invite Second Neve to the floor.
Three things to do in this speech. Firstly, on the ability to prevent or warn against crimes of those who actively want to reoffend. How does that change in this debate? Secondly, then, on the victims. Thirdly, on reoffending and the changing of behaviour of criminals. And then lastly, my split point on the impact on the individual person and how certain communities are more impacted in this debate. So firstly, on your ability to warn others. I think that was the majority of the case that we heard that came out at First F, is that if you are wanting to reoffend, you're less likely to do so. For example, if you're on a date, you can see that someone has an ankle bracelet and you don't do that. But I think what they have failed to recognise is the way in which criminals' behaviour changes when they now have an ankle bracelet. Rather than waiting a couple of dates in order to harm someone, you do it on the very first one. You go and you build up an online dating portfolio, for example, and you get to meet someone, and then on that very first date, you assault them or you violently harm them. This means that there's no time for the victim to see any warning signs or any red flags in order to prevent themselves from being harmed in the future. They are much more likely to be harmed in the first place. Secondly, we think that you don't just wait or linger around a place where you might wanting to commit a crime. You do it immediately and violently as soon as you get there. And thirdly, we tell you that you likely tell this person to meet you in a more isolated place where others aren't there to protect you or help you. I think those are the harms that they have to stand for on their side of the debate. And those are incredibly more harmful than on our side when we reduce the chance of reoffending, when we protect people and we use existing mechanisms to protect them. What else do we get? We think that specifically, because the bracelet is now more normalised and more people are wearing it, we tell you that those who see it probably don't, it doesn't mean as much to them, right? Like you could have people who committed a violent crime, robbed a dairy with a knife when they were 18, and now they're 60. This means that the public doesn't generally know what to believe anymore, and the sign doesn't mean as much as it does in the status quo on our side of the debate, where ultimately, because you have a monitoring bracelet, it means you've been released and you're on parole from prison in the most recent term. I think that's particularly harmful because if they're wanting to protect victims, on our side of the house, we prevent those victims from being harmed significantly, and it also means that those who are most likely to do violent crime, who have just most recently been released from prison, are actually held accountable on our side of the house. Furthermore, they tell you that we have a greater mechanism in order to track people and preventing them from, because we can see harmful patterns. Before I move on to that, I will take your POI.
Does a community officer in the status quo monitoring and even other violent criminals have the ability to stop crimes on your side?
We tell you on our side of the house, each individual person has an individual parole officer who might even be living in their same room, especially after they've committed something like in the same house, preventing them from reoffending. Moving on then to the ability to track and see harmful patterns. I think when they tell you that location is the best way or mechanism of telling people, this simply is not true. We think that violence can occur anywhere, and particularly in the home, and necessarily that's what this shows you, is that just because someone is outside a gun store, they're walking down a street, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be committing a violent crime. What do we tell you instead? We tell you that a person lurking and then teachers or the gun, the owner of the store recognizing that is a much better mechanism because they know the patterns of the day-to-day life. They know what is normal. Someone who is just going through tens after thousands of different data for the day and trying to find a pattern doesn't necessarily pick that up. We think on our side of the house we are better able to prevent crimes from happening without wasting government resources and without having excessive surveillance, which is incredibly harmful for the reoffending of criminals. I think at the end of this, what you have to believe is that we have existing mechanisms in the status quo where you can walk over and warn someone. We think that crime doesn't occur in these sort of isolated locations where it is much more harmful, where people are much more vulnerable, and that is what we are proud to support inside Negating. Moving then on to the victims. I think when they tell you that they win this debate simply because they care more about the victims, they fail to recognise that a justice system and victims in general are also impacted by the ability of criminals to reoffend. At the point at which you care about victims, you also have to care about criminals. And I think we've done more work in this debate thus far to prove that criminals are more likely to reoffend. But I'm going to talk about this a bit more. Firstly, specifically on victims. They've said that you are now able to move on because you have data to back up and tell you what is going on. I don't think this is likely to occur for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because you know that the criminal is now much more fixated on you, as Anshika told you, because of the bracelet, because of the permanent and physical reminder of the person who has locked them up for life, who changed their life, for example. And secondly, we tell you that you are not in a much better place because you know that the person who did crime to you can now be more easily identified and radicalized by criminal groups and by gangs. This means that on their side of the house, they have to stand for people being being worried that these criminals are going to come after you in a much more harmful way. They're going to do even worse things to you than that they have done previously. I think that's really harmful for the victims, and it means that they are much worse off psychologically on their side of the house. But note also, I think, that it's unreasonable for them to just say that victims can never move on. Like, oftentimes we have, like, families forgiving those who have committed crime because they recognise that in the greater interest of society, it's better for us to, like, rehabilitate criminals, integrate them back into society, and re-accept them so that they don't go on to harm other families. And I think that most people are willing to, like, weigh up that potential harm, and we see that often in the criminal justice system. Furthermore, what we tell you is that in order for them to prove that victims are going to feel better, it's reliant on them proving the first point, right, that they're going to be able to prevent crime. And I think that we've also proven to you that that is simply not true. Moving on then to about the ability to reoffend. They have told you that our mechanisms in this debate means that violence is ingrained and it's incredibly difficult to mean that you are able to remove it. I think what we've told you is that the specific factors of the environment are things that you are able to change, such as your economic status when you get a job or you're supported to go and do work, such as like poverty, or like if you're removed from the location in which you're brought up with violence or you remove those gang connections, then you are less likely to be violent, which means that we're able to prove to you you are able to rehabilitate people on our side of the house. And we've told you that specifically when they tell you about like, oh, people feel bad and people feel guilt and that's a good thing, we're able to flip that material when we tell you that it results in them feeling more like against others who they feel like they've been punished already, but now they're being further punished beyond what is reasonable. You know, like people haven't gotten just off scot-free, they've gone to prison, they've done their time, but now we're extending that beyond what a judge would deem to be reasonable in the status quo, which means that they can't move on and it means that they do more harm. And I think they need to do some more substantial responses to Anshika's material that we heard in her first point. Moving on to then my split point on the impact on the individual person and criminal. I think that uniquely because like marginalised communities or activists, for example, are groups that this tool may be weaponised against, it means that we shouldn't use it in the status quo. I think that it offers unique harms to criminals and like you're like principally like your privacy is impeded, you have a constant feeling of being monitored, which means that your mental health is extremely degraded to the point in which you likely commit even more crime. But we also tell you that it gives you too much power to the government to monitor the activities of people. For example, if an activist is going out and trying to create change, but they might use like violent methods like we saw with the suffragettes in the first wave of feminism, they might be likely to be targeted by the government in this regard and tracked, reducing their ability to create change within our society. I think that's a very unique harm of being able to tell someone that because you've done one thing that we deem to be bad for the rest of your life, for the rest of your ability to create change and impact in society, we are now going to be constantly monitoring you and knowing where you are. And I think that's really bad.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech and invite Third back to the floor.
One of my granddad's best mates is an ex-IRA hitman. Every time he goes to visit the city of Belfast, he has to have all of his movements tracked. And he still does it. Why? Because these people do not think that this is an infringement of their rights. They know that they have infringed other people's rights by murdering them. Criminals do not think it is like justifiably unreasonable for you to try to stop them from killing more people. So proud to affirm here. So a few things to do in my speech. Firstly, framing on why people commit crime, right? Then secondly, on reoffending and the effects on criminals, and then lastly on the psychological harms on victims. Firstly, why do people commit crime, right? We hear like a pretty consistent push from Neg throughout their whole case that the people who commit these crimes are vulnerable socially, and that this becomes from the idea that like it is in human nature not to be violent to other people, that everybody inherently has this desire to come around and sing Kumbaya together. We are a peaceful social species. We think this doesn't apply here, right? This human nature argument is not so convincing when 97% of women experience some kind of sexual assault at some point in their life. I think there's a difference here, right? If you are struggling socially and you want to try and feed your family because you cannot hold a job, you go and steal some money or you steal some food. You do not go rape some random woman on the street. You do not go and stab 7 people in a countdown. These crimes are not motivated by necessity. They are motivated by passion, right? This is really, really important for this debate, especially when it comes to reoffending, right? So reoffending, the effects on cons. I think for both of us here, the path to victory is quite obvious, right? Largely, you prove a reduction in reoffending. But I think specifically here, right, we win by proving how our stuff better resonates with these actors, criminals. How do they think? What do they do? And why do we stop them from doing really, really bad things, right? So let's talk about this in a few different areas. Firstly, on surveillance. Firstly, I think surveillance is super, super clear and tangible. There's a lot of mechanisms we give you at the start about especially Beth especially gets fleshed out when we tell you about the police's ability to investigate these things. Yes, just knowing where someone is isn't enough to stop them from doing a crime, but it is enough to lead to an investigation where you can completely shelter them off from committing a crime at all, right? The surveillance maybe on its own doesn't magically mean that guy has no arms and can't do that crime anymore, but that is a distinct pathway to preventing that crime from occurring. We tell you that. We tell you how resources are implemented so that these people cannot do these things anymore, right? Then we hear some negative material towards this, right? We hear this half-cooked counter model at Second Neg that everyone has their own parole officer. The one response here is how many people do you think are parole officers, right? Do we have enough people so that every time anyone commits a crime we have a new parole officer? I think that implies that 25% of New Zealand's population are parole officers, which I just think numerically isn't true, right? Then lastly here, we hear really that the incentives are unclear at places. This is how Neg tries to shut down our whole case. They try to tell you that just because you know a guy who shot someone to death is at a gun shop doesn't mean he's buying the gun to shoot someone. He could be I don't know, going hunting or something, right? We don't hear enough examples as to what a criminal could be doing at a gun shop other than buying a gun to shoot people with, right? But I think there's so many mechs that we give you and that I can expand upon here as to why that this is really, really crucial, right? I think if you're a gun shop owner, you don't this guy doesn't have an obligation to tell you, hey, I'm going to buy this pistol, and by the way, I killed 50 people 20 years ago, right? But what he does have the incentive to do and the requirement to do is to wear that thing on his ankle. You see that as he comes in. I think that means that you just don't sell him the gun. If he doesn't have the gun, he can't shoot anyone with it. I think that means if you're a teacher and you spy this guy across the road, you think, okay, I'm going to walk in here. My kids are potentially in danger, right? So then, with surveillance stuff standing strong, how does Neg present us with an alternative? Along a few different lines, right? Firstly, on a lack of rehabilitation. I think their employment stuff, not yet, is so marginally exclusive that it's largely mute, right? The idea that the only harms to employment are specifically in front-facing roles. I think in either world, you're unlikely to put a hardened, violent criminal like rapist, murderer, or assaulter on the front desk of McDonald's. You probably don't do that anyway, right? I think there are a lot of job opportunities that are unique, it's exclusive in either world, where if you're a con, you still get those jobs like being a bin man for the city council. All of those initiatives specifically designed to get perps back into the working world. This stuff is largely undercooked, right? You commit violent crimes, again, not for money, right? You commit violent crimes because it is a crime of passion, because that is an emotional thing, right? So then we hear about no warning signs. You don't get you can't prevent people from committing crimes. There's no red flags. I think this is so wrong for so many reasons. You have a massive beeping red flag strapped to your leg at all times, right? I think not only do the police know where you are, but the police are probably uniquely equipped to respond to a situation where you are at any given time, right? The police not only know, hey, this guy's over here, but they probably are set up, especially if you're fresh out of prison, to be able to respond to you reoffending, because they know that you reoffending is a problem that might occur. That's why you have the bracelet. And lastly, on gangs, I'm going to spend the most time on this, because I think this is the biggest push, especially from Second Neg here, right? The gangs see you as new talent, and they sort of, hustle up to you and they're like, hey, join my gang, right? I feel like this is just so wrong. Why would a gang let somebody with a tracking thing that tells the police exactly where they are into their super secret headquarters where they were smuggling in cocaine? Like, if you are a gang leader and you do that, you should be fired because you are the worst gang leader in the history of the world, right? I feel like they also just have an inherent mistrust of these people. You are quite bad at being a criminal, obviously, because you did a crime and then got caught. Why am I recruiting you into my gang? This doesn't make any sense at all. It's just not mechanized fully whatsoever. So on this, right, even if you buy all of the outcomes they tell you about how cons are better off in their world, I simply think you just do not care. Every single person on the street that you see right now out the window, there's no one there yet, but there will be, these people are a potential stakeholder for us. They are the most important people in the debate, and we tell you how even after crime occurs in either world, we get better outcomes for them. How do we do that? Let's talk about psychological harms on victims. I think what we have to do here, right, is prove a positive impact to these people psychologically, to the most vulnerable people here. What Neg has to do, essentially a third in leaders, is weigh this down super hard and tell you why you don't care about the victims of these crimes, because they've not presented us with enough mechanistic information as to why our stuff isn't true. They've given us a bit, and I'm going to tell you right now why it doesn't stand. So essentially, they tell you that this bracelet doesn't mean much, right? Essentially, because so many people have these bracelets, and something like old people do, you look at it and go, well, he could be a violent criminal, but he'll still not be, right? I feel like if this is true, first, it contradicts all of Neg's rehab material, and all of their employment stuff, all of their con stuff goes completely out the window, and it doesn't make sense anymore. I think, though, it isn't true, and I'll let Neg keep that material, all right? Because it's not true because of fear, right? You see this, and the fact that that guy could be a murderer or could be a rapist is enough to probably make you at least think that it's a big deal and something worth thinking about. I think this idea that the bracelet inspires vengeance in the criminal, and you're going to want to go after these people and become further radicalized, right? Firstly, I think it's harder to offend in any case, right? Just practically. Also, the way that Neg tries to prove this is by co-opting our guilt material into saying that you are guilty and then you become more angry. I think when you are guilty, inherently, just by the definition, you feel more empathy for the person you've committed a crime against. That is what guilt is. In the case where guilt is their only mechanism for this point doesn't work. So what is the point of all of this psych material? I think this is debate winning if you buy it. These people have faced permanent psychological effects, right? Even if you buy that every single criminal gets a nice condo and a mansion and they can live a great life, we simply do not care. As Al Pacino's character says to Robert De Niro in Heat, right? If you mess with innocent people, I don't care. Brother, you are going down. Proud to affirm. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his speech and invite third Neg to the floor.
I'm sorry, Amazon. Tables. So much paper. Okay. There were three things opposition needed to prove. Three things affirming needed to prove to win this debate. One, that they are actually able to solve the problem of crime, or reduce it. two, that it outweighs the harms they introduce by monitoring people constantly, and three, that it's an efficient and effective way of actually preventing that and doing that. So, one, on crime. I think this is generally the big issue in today's debate. Just like quickly before we start, one, I think of Affirming really wanted to say, really wanted to be the big party of oh yeah, but crime happens regardless, rehab happens regardless. Obviously, ankle bracelets aren't the biggest issue. They've gone to prison, right? Stuff has happened. I think what you need to buy is not whether a crime happens on one side or the other, it's which side has less crime or which side has less severe crime. I think that's where we win this debate. I don't think either side can prove they prevent all crime. That's entirely unreasonable. And secondly, on what crimes happen, right? Because they give you most of their pushes based on rape, which is one of the most severe violent crimes in fairness. But what you also need to believe is that aggravated robbery, which is shoplifting when you have a knife on you, is also considered a violent crime under their model of any crime that includes violence. I think you also need to believe that any person that shoplifted with a knife also has an ankle monitor all time, and you also need to apply the same mechanisms to there, and that's where their case fails, and we introduce massive harms which we uniquely get on our side. So now, on crime.
You are.
No. So I think we've given you two really big, important pushes that just weren't really engaged with. Which is one, it's much harder to change when you have a permanent bracelet on you that reminds you of the thing you used to be. I think the idea of rehabilitation and change happens when you are able to not be the same person, when you have a constant physical and psychological reminder of the harm you did. It's a massive harm that you cannot create a full change. I think that you have to believe that they are at least in some level stuck to the past. And I think secondly, on the point of alienation, and that's where both teams there's a bit of an unclarity point of but it doesn't you're not completely alienated, but you're also not completely integrated, right? I think what you need to buy here is that if you take the awareness point of people are aware because of the crime or the danger because they can see your change and react to it, you have to buy that people would be less willing to engage with people who have this bracelet, even if they're 45-year-old now and they committed a violent crime when they are 15, right? This massively changed. They're not the same person, but they're still not able to integrate on their own Affirming side. That's a massive harm. That's a way which they cannot get rehabilitation because people are just not able to integrate on their side. They are uniquely able to do so on our side.
Who are?
Now, quickly on gun shops, right? They tell us that, one, if you're in a gun shop, you're guaranteed to commit a crime. I think that's obviously unreasonable. And secondly, or they tell us that the gun shop owner can't just know whether you're going to commit a crime, so it doesn't help you. Gun shops have required background checks, right? You obviously do know whether they're you obviously do see what their intentions are. I don't think the ankle bracelets help you at all in knowing that, because you have to check the background anyway. And now, quickly on gangs, they tell us that a gang isn't going to recruit a person because they were caught for a crime once. And in terms of the headquarters point, gangs don't have massive CEO headquarters change of operations that are crucially missing. They generally just happen on the street in communities. I don't think they need to have a massive chain of operations there. And generally, gangs recruit people based on their willingness to do crime because they are already vulnerable. They would be fine going to prison. Generally, gang members go to prison 10, 15 times. It's not gang members just never go to prison. I think that's a massive unreasonable claim. Before I move on, I will take a POI.
On your side, when you never know that these people are in touch with the gang, how are they rehabilitated?
I think people are just less likely to be I don't think you can claim that benefit, right? Because you don't know whether they're in a gang just because you have their location. So I don't think you can claim any benefits. And two, we just get less people being recruited into gangs because they're less vulnerable targets. So now, quickly on the big push on the harms to individuals. They tell us that if you know that your offender has is being tracked, you feel much safer. 3 responses on why that is not true. One is that generally the big psychological harms in domestic abuse and in rape is the giant statistics that says only 5% of offenders ever face charges, only 1% are ever convicted. I don't think they can claim a benefit there because they're not being convicted on either side. Secondly, if they are convicted, you don't get a massive harm there because they've been to prison, they've faced justice. I don't think whether or not their location is being tracked by the police is massively important. And then secondly, for them to claim the benefit of assuredness, the data of the location needs to be publicly accessible, which seems like a massive harm on their side, which we're not really elaborated on. If only the police has the access, it's not really a massive benefit on psychological harm. I don't think you can weight massively highly. And then lastly on the point of they just won't be able to enter a restaurant or a gun shop because they might use it to commit a crime. That's such a massive infringement on people's rights. I don't think you can limit a person's ability to go anywhere just because they committed a crime 15 years ago. I think that's entirely unreasonable. Now, moving on to the new harms they introduce on their sites, right? Because even if you do buy any of their material on why crime is likely to be reduced, I think you do need to buy that it might be marginal at best or not at all. But if you buy that material, you have to also believe that the massive harms we introduce at we introduce at Anshika and Isabella, that you're much less likely to contribute to society because you're alienated. So you're less likely to volunteer or economically contribute. You also you have such a massive psychological harm of being tracked at all times, right? I think generally everyone agrees that the panopticon is a massive bad idea. They literally give you the panopticon. I don't think that's such a massive psychological harm on people. I think we do need to consider that because I don't think they can just say we just don't care about people. It's teens who committed a violent crime 20 years ago. I think we do need to and they've already faced justice by serving their punishment. I think you do need to believe them. And then lastly, even if you buy that they prevent crime and that they're able to mitigate the new harms they introduce, they also needed to prove that their ability to do it is really efficient. Because they tell you that we're gonna have ankle monitors and we have people monitoring the location data and we're gonna have people going to background to do checks on them. If we can just fund the soup kitchen for the same reason and actually prevent crime in the first place and actually create such a massive benefit, we have to win this debate because it's such a better alternative.
Alright, I'd like to thank the speaker for his speech. We'll move to reply speeches now. A reminder, reply speeches are up to 4 minutes. I'll give 1 clap at 3 minutes, 2 claps at 4, and no POIs in reply. As is customary, we'll reverse the speaking order, so I'll invite the negating team up to give the leader's reply.
Under Affirming's model, crime becomes worse, it becomes more damaging for victims, and more people are harmed. I think you cannot stand for that. A couple of things to prove. Firstly, on the types of crime that is going to occur in rehabilitation, are we likely to get more crime? Secondly, when crime does occur, are we able to prevent it using the mechanism of surveillance? And then lastly, on the psychological impacts. I think firstly, on whether or not you want to prevent more crime, I don't think us winning this debate is reliant on us proving that criminals tend to be having underlying mechanisms that mean that they tend to commit crime. I'll go into that later, but I think that we've sufficiently proved in this debate that they can't just say that people do violent things because they do violent things. Like when we tell you that people do violence or they rape someone because they've grown up in a family in which violence is normalised, in which they are being surrounded by it in their communities, I think you have to believe that there is some sort of degree to which that is important. I think when we tell you that the criminal justice system directly accounts for the fact of like people's factors in their lives that have affected their ability to do crime, they take that into account when they do their sentencing, we must believe that there is some sort of impact on violent criminals that is meaning that they do crime, and if we are able to reduce that through rehabilitation, if we are able to ensure the effectiveness of rehabilitation, then we're also able to win this debate. But I think we've also told you that people who are particularly violent in nature, who like the kind of criminals that they talk about on their side of the house, are better able to do crime where they do it in a very different way, like more hidden, it's more immediate, it's in like alleys, and that is much more harmful to people. So even when we only claim those sorts of people in this debate, I think they are much more harmful and they do worse things. They get tied into gangs and they go on to do even more harmful stuff. But secondly then on rehabilitation after once you have done crime. I think uniquely rehabilitation, it's used across our criminal justice system, but it's used both for people who have grown up in environments that have conditioned them to be violent, but it's also used to correct people who may be innately violent. I think we have told you in this debate that it's important to prevent reoffending again, and we've told you that the ability to do rehabilitation is significantly decreased when you have an ankle bracelet. You have a constant physical reminder, you have constant surveillance and monitoring which impacts on your mental well-being and your ability to focus on you succeeding in life. We've told you that your economic outcomes, like the ability to even just go to a school and drop off your child, your ability to engage with social services or go to a supermarket are hugely impeded, and you feel more alienated and isolated from society, which are the exact mechanisms that we need to be undoing in order to prevent people from doing violent crime in the future. We've also told you about gang recruitment, how often they will tend to target vulnerable people even more, even if they try to tell you that no, because they've got the secret, maybe they're not going to get into the highest levels of a gang and the secret little underground organizations. We tell you that on a base level in communities, they're going to be more likely to be involved in gangs, which means you're less able to rehabilitate people and you get more crime. And so if they tell you they care about victims, they have to stand for more rehabilitation. Secondly, on the mechanism to prevent crime, I think we've proven to you sufficiently that firstly this is a huge waste of resources, but we would much rather spend, and we said this from Unshika, on other things like soup kitchens, for example. But we've told you that things like background checks or identifying patterns of behaviour are much more effective than just simply having a police officer looking at data every minute and trying to look through a bazillion different things. Lastly, on the psychological impact, you feel safer when you know that people are rehabilitated and less likely to recommit, but we also tell you that you feel safer when you know that they have faced justice, and at that point they can't just stand for things like rape or domestic abuse, which often don't go through the justice system. But we also tell you that you don't feel safer when you know that they could commit worse crimes against you, or that they're likely to remember you because of the fact that they were wearing an ankle bracelet. That is why we believe that people are psychologically better off on our side of the house.
Alright, I'd like to thank the speaker for her speech and invite the affirmative to give their leaders reply and close the debate.
the ability to know where your rapist is all the time, where your abusive ex-husband is with just one walk to the police station, is the difference between security and not security, and even the difference between life and death if left unchecked. Okay, what to do in this reply? So firstly on crimes themselves, then on like gangs and criminals, just like a general comparative on like how this all weighs up against each other. So very quickly on crimes themselves, right? We tell you that violent crimes are not crimes of necessity. I characterized this to you at first F. I told you that a violent crime is a crime causing bodily harm, not robbing someone at gunpoint. It is pulling the trigger. We told you this from the start, and we didn't get that contestation until like literally reply. I don't think this is like the time to bring that up. I don't think it stands. Okay, and then secondly, like they tell you about the background checks and patterns of behavior are more effective. Look, I just don't think this is necessarily true, which leads me onto this on like gangs and criminals, right? They tell us about like the mechanism of guilt, like what make people radicalized. Look, I think inherently we tell you down the line that guilt is literally the process of feeling bad about something, of feeling remorseful for your actions. They use this as their sole mechanism for this, which I think just means it literally doesn't stand, right? Because guilt is always something that makes you feel remorseful, right? We also tell you gangs are just unlikely to take in these people. They're tracked, they're monitored, they're caught. You know where the big gang houses are, right? It's a bit suspicious if 12 ankle monitors are all in the exact same place at the exact same time, right? I think they cannot claim that crime is more hidden on our side because it's literally the opposite of a secret, right? You will always know where every criminal is at all times. That is always going to be a benefit. No matter how much I try to mitigate that, it will always be true that if you know where someone is and know what they're doing, it is easier to stop them from doing something terrible, right? On their side, they have no clarity. They have no idea of where these people are or what they could be doing. They have no idea. This goes for the victims and the police officers, right? That just inherently means that reoffending is so much more likely, right? In their best case, like, these people can be rehabilitated, but the future innocent people continue to be harmed. Okay. So dealing with gangs then, so on the comparative after this, right? I think they tell us about people being haunted by guilt, right? They tell you that like excessive surveillance is going to cause 10 times the amount of like gang entrance and resentment. But their counter model tells us these people have their own personal parole officer in their house. That's an equal amount of surveillance. If you like, there's like just as much surveillance. If you think you can't limit people's freedom, I don't see why it's different in the status quo, right? I don't think this principle of freedom based on a crime years ago, like parole terms just do that. It happens on both sides, right? I think what actually matters here is at the very least you have to believe that continually monitoring someone makes it easy to prevent things. I think even if this means we only reduce the 97% to the 83%, that's a crazy big impact, right? This is huge. If we prevent 1,000 women from entering a domestically abusive relationship, posing the risk of death, of turmoil, of irreversible trauma, this is winning material, right? Because these relationships never happening in the first place. It's thousands of people never being permanently traumatized, never having the worst things that could happen to a human being happen to a human being. You just have to buy this matters so much, right? We told you about when you don't know if someone's after you, it causes anxiety, isolation, agoraphobia, right? The only real response here was about like, discussing that, oh, well, they'll do more violent crimes. I don't think this is true because when you are the victim and there's an ankle monitor on the person coming after you, if you feel unsafe, you just go to the police and they can see they come after you and arrest them again, right? This is just very intuitive. I think at the end of this debate, right, that you don't have these horrific psychological wounds. You like just have a sense of security. Not only do less crimes themselves get committed, but like these people just feel safer in their own lives. They just don't have like this looming fear and trauma and annoyance that someone is living their life or they don't get to, right? The other team tells you all this stuff about how we can't limit people's lives based on something they did once. I think the victims' lives will be limited for the rest of their lives forever. This is not fair. I am proud to stand.
All right, I'd like to thank all speakers for a good debate. I'll invite you to cross the floor, shake hands.
Good job.